Okay, this session we're going to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to look at them specifically as they apply to youth work and to development education. What are the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, they're part of a global agreement and consultation process that has been going on for a number of years, and goes under the title of Agenda 2030. And Agenda 2030 is it's a United Nations initiative, and it's a bilateral agreement between a multilateral agreement between most countries of the world to look at how development is going to be targeted, how it's going to be measured, and how it's going to be supported. It's a successor process to the Millennium Development Goals, and the Millennium Development Goals would have been in place between 2000 and 2015, and were quite successful in terms of focusing development efforts on specific targets. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in 2015 and came into force in 2016 when all member states of the United Nations. Now, there are a number of member states, small number of member states that weren't in a position at the time to ratify them, but the vast majority of the functioning governments of the world have ratified the Sustainable Development Goals. And the commitment enshrined in these goals is to, as written out here, is about human dignity. Central to it is human dignity, which is enormously important. They're not economic goals, they're not environmental goals. They're goals about the capacity for everybody to achieve their full potential. It's also obviously then in that context about ending poverty and reducing inequalities. And this is, again, it's an important characteristic of the Millennium Development Goals, because historically the concept of inequality was not a particularly important global political priority within the Millennium Development Goals. Inequality wasn't seen as being an impeder of development, whereas now it is, and it's very much seen both within countries and between countries, that vast inequalities exist, and that those inequalities lead to injustices. Also, obviously, ecological degradation and climate change are a key consideration in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so if we look then at the 2030 Agenda, it's not a huge document, as these types of documents go, and it's divided up into the sections that are outlined in this slide. The preamble and the declaration are sort of technical elements to it, but the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets are very important. And the thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, as was the case with the Millennium Development Goals, was that there was that each goal has a defined number of targets that will be they're measurable targets, and they will be used to measure progress against the achievement of each of the goals. So what it is with the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that is important is that it is a commitment, but not like UN conventions and treaties are legally binding on the part of governments, but these are not. And that it's up to each government themselves to develop policies and strategies within their own national context, and in terms of their dealing with other countries to address the individual goals. So some people would regard it as a weakness that they're not legally binding. Some people would say that it's critically important for them not to be legally binding, because if that you wouldn't have gotten the universal acceptance of the the Sustainable Development Goals if they were going to be legally binding. So it's the political analysis that it's universal ambition and national ownership. So it's making that balance between each country taking responsibility for the Sustainable Development Goals, and that at the same time that there is a collective synergy in terms of their achievement internationally. Okay, there is an acceptance that these are enormously ambitious, and that it is probably one of the most ambitious agendas that has been set by the United Nations, and I suppose, as I say, builds from the success of the Millennium Goals, but goes way beyond them in terms of its structure and how the Sustainable Development Goals are framed. Now, one of the, I suppose, the overarching principle is that no one would be left behind. And this is seen as I suppose, a response that to, I suppose, what's perceived. The Millennium Development Goals went a long way towards securing some of the targets in terms of literacy, in terms of access to clean water, but in some parts of the world and in some communities within certain countries, there was very little impact made by the Millennium Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals specifically are looking at both international targets but also targets within countries, so within developed and less developed countries, countries of the global south and of the global north. Ban Ki-moon has I suppose presented these Sustainable Development Goals as a challenge to, as he would see it, the first generation that has the capacity to eradicate poverty, and that he would see it, and the declaration and the preamble to the declaration would see it as being our responsibility as a generation to ensure that sustainability is restored in terms of global development. Okay, so what are they? There's 17 goals, and that they will last obviously for the period between 2015 and 2030. That the priorities relate to people, the planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. I suppose the other focus is on popular participation and political participation. And again, as we mentioned, the priority is that these Sustainable Development Goals are universally applied. All of these issues listed on the left-hand side here are related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Every aspect of our economy, every aspect of society, every aspect of our environment has a connection with the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And every country, and this is what's different with the Sustainable Development Goals, every country has to develop their own national action plan, and that is to address the Sustainable Development Goals within their own countries. So Ireland has an obligation to develop a plan to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in Ireland. And I suppose that is what the essence of it is that we have to link the local to the global. So here in Ireland, we have to take as much responsibility for the Sustainable Development Goals as do people in less developed countries in the global south. So the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals are fourfold. It enables people to realize their full potential and to build their confidence with dignity and fulfillment. It's also a process that frees people from fear of want and exploitation. And it's to ensure that people's standard of living and their livelihoods are secure. The third thing is that the Sustainable Development Goals are seeking to address the needs of future generations as well as the needs of our own generation. And then finally, to secure balance between the needs of the environment, of society, and of the political and economic systems. Then if you look at the priorities in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about participation in the life of the community. It's about a fairer distribution of wealth. And again, as I say, this is an interesting addition to United Nations policy over and above the Millennium Development Goals. Political and environmental stability, sustainable economic growth, healthier and happier lives for everybody. And then this issue of dependence by nations on other nations. And this is enormously important, and it relates back, we'll deal with this in future lectures, but it relates back to colonialism, to neocolonialism, to economic exploitation. So there's a whole range of political and economic factors that tie one country to another in terms of dependence. And this addressing dependency is important in the Sustainable Development Goals. Basic needs for all, interdependence between nations. And this is the counter side to the previous bullet point around dependence between one nation. Interdependence is completely different. Interdependence is where there is a mutual relationship or a mutual dependence between countries, not one of one country depending upon another. And then finally, and this is the mantra that goes through the Sustainable Development Goals, that no one should be left behind. Okay, so why is it important that we look at the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, I mean, the numbers are quite staggering when we look at the current population of the world and the rate at which the population of the world in certain parts of the world is increasing. We do need to have better mutual understanding between countries because of the nature of how politics and economics is done now, it is enormously important for us to be aware of the relationships that there is between countries and the impact that inequality has. If we look then at the distribution of resources, and this is a very crude optic through which to look at the distribution of resources, but say 1/7 of the world's population controls 80% of the resources. That the numbers of people, so this proportion will decline in favor of the 1 billion, so to speak. So the proportion, as the population of people in less developed countries or in the global south increases, so too will the imbalance that is there in terms of the distribution of wealth. So it's also important for us to be aware that youth work and looking at youth work, this is critically important, but because this is critically important in terms of the future of our planet. If you look at these Sustainable Development Goals as lasting for 15 years, then those young people who are working with us now, who are in their teens, will be in their 30s potentially by the time this phase in development has been completed. It's also important for us to be conscious that the National Youth Strategy is part of and can be part of the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can take the strategies that we want the government to implement on behalf of young people and align them with the Sustainable Development Goals in order to add weight to the policies that we want pursued in favour of young people. So if we look specifically at young people, there are nearly 2 billion young people between the ages of 10 and 24. It's the highest proportion of young people that have been alive ever. That 90% of those live in developing countries, and the vast majority of those are living on very low income. There's a huge number of young people who are unemployed. And it is enormously important for us to know why that is the case. Why is it that so many young people are living in poverty? Why is it that so many young people are facing unemployment? So if we're looking at, this is from the National Youth Council's documentation on the Sustainable Development Goals, if we're looking at working with young people around the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to look first of all at where they're at. Young people can be in very different places in terms of their understanding and their capacity to absorb some of these issues. We need to make global connections, and that is enormously important. That young people need to be aware that we're talking about young people in other countries. We need to look at local and global injustices in order to be able to help young people rationalize what injustice and inequality, the consequences of justice and inequality in both their own areas and on a global level. And we need young people to be optimistic about the future. We need them to imagine how the future might be better. Action is enormously important, and also critical self-reflection on young people's own experiences and on the experience of others.